The Immortal Sergeant, Alvin York. He was a simple farmer who didn't believe in killing, a man who tried to avoid the war entirely. But on October 8, 1918, in a forest in France, this reluctant soldier would do the impossible. Armed with a rifle and a pistol, he would single-handedly capture 132 German soldiers, silence 35 machine guns, and kill at least 25 enemy combatants. Military historians still can't fully explain how one man accomplished what should have been impossible. This is the story of the most decorated American soldier of World War I. Stay until the end to discover why the man who became America's greatest war hero spent the rest of his life trying to forget what he did. Alvin Cullum York was born on December 13, 1887, in a two-room log cabin in Pall Mall, Tennessee. He entered a world of crushing poverty, isolated mountain communities, and traditions that hadn't changed in generations. His father, William Uriah York, was a blacksmith and subsistence farmer who struggled to feed his family. His mother, Mary Elizabeth Brooks York, raised 11 children in that tiny cabin, stretching every resource to its limit. The York family lived in the mountains of northern Tennessee, in Fentress County, one of the poorest regions in one of the poorest states in America. The soil was rocky and unforgiving. The growing season was short. Winters were brutal. Families survived by hunting, farming small plots of land, and helping each other through hardships. Money was scarce. Most transactions were conducted through barter and trade. Alvin was the third of 11 children. From his earliest memories, he worked. There was no childhood as we understand it today. Mountain children worked from the time they could walk. Young Alvin helped his father in the blacksmith shop, worked the family's small farm, hunted game to feed the family, and did whatever odd jobs might earn a few cents. Education was a luxury the York family couldn't afford. Alvin attended school sporadically, completing only 3rd grade before dropping out permanently to work full-time. He learned to read at a basic level and could do simple arithmetic, but formal education ended before he was 10 years old. Everything else he learned from living: how to survive in the mountains, how to shoot, how to work with his hands, how to be tough when toughness was required for survival. Shooting was essential in the Tennessee mountains. Families relied on hunting for food. Each bullet cost money, so accuracy mattered. You couldn't afford to miss. Each wasted shot meant less money for flour or salt or other necessities. Alvin learned to shoot with his father's muzzle-loading rifle, a weapon that required perfect shot placement because reloading took precious time. By his teenage years, Alvin York was known throughout Fentress County as an exceptional marksman. The York family was deeply religious, members of a small mountain church that preached a literal interpretation of the Bible. Alvin's mother raised his children to fear God, respect the commandments, and live simply. The church forbade dancing, drinking, gambling, and violence. These teachings would later create an enormous moral crisis for Alvin when he was forced to choose between religious principles and military duty. But as a young man, Alvin York strayed from his religious upbringing. In his late teens and early 20s, he fell in with a rough crowd. He drank moonshine whiskey, got into fights, gambled, and generally raised hell throughout Fentress County. He worked various jobs, logging, farming, construction, and spent his earnings on alcohol and gambling. He became known as a troublemaker, a man with a quick temper and quicker fists. Alvin's father died in 1911, when Alvin was 23 years old. As the oldest son still at home, Alvin became responsible for supporting his mother and younger siblings. The weight of this responsibility, combined with the death of a close friend in a bar fight, caused Alvin to reconsider his life. He attended a revival meeting at his mother's church and experienced a religious conversion that changed him completely. The transformation was dramatic. Alvin quit drinking, stopped fighting, and became a devoted member of the Church of Christ in Christian Union, a small fundamentalist denomination. He attended church services multiple times per week, studied the Bible intensively, and tried to live according to strict religious principles. The church taught that all violence was sinful, that Christians should not participate in warfare, that the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," meant exactly what it said. For several years, Alvin York lived peacefully as a devout Christian farmer. He worked hard, supported his family, courted a local girl named Gracie Williams, and tried to be a good man according to his religious beliefs. He became an elder in his church, leading prayer meetings and teaching Sunday school. His wild youth seemed like ancient history. Alvin York had found peace. Then came April 1917. The United States entered World War I, declaring war on Germany. President Woodrow Wilson called for a military draft to raise an army large enough to fight in Europe. All men between certain ages were required to register for potential military service. Alvin York, now 29 years old, received his draft registration notice. He was devastated. His religious beliefs forbade participation in warfare. The Bible said, "Thou shalt not kill," and "love your enemies." His church taught that Christians should not take human life under any circumstances. How could he reconcile military service with his faith? Alvin filed for conscientious objector status, explaining that his religious beliefs prevented him from serving in combat. His application was denied. The draft board ruled that his church wasn't on the approved list of recognized pacifist denominations like Quakers or Mennonites. The Church of Christ in Christian Union was too small, too obscure. Alvin's personal religious beliefs, no matter how sincere, weren't sufficient grounds for exemption. He would be drafted into the United States Army and sent to war. On November 15, 1917, Alvin York reported for military training at Camp Gordon, Georgia. He was assigned to Company G, 328th Infantry Regiment, 82nd Division. His company commander was Captain Edward Courtney Danforth, a graduate of Harvard University, and everything Alvin was not: educated, wealthy, worldly. But Danforth recognized something special in the quiet mountain man who could shoot better than anyone he had ever seen. Alvin struggled with his conscience throughout training. He was a model soldier in every way except one. He still believed that killing was sinful. He excelled at marksmanship training, consistently outperforming every other soldier. He was physically tough, could march all day carrying heavy equipment, never complained. But he couldn't resolve the moral crisis. How could he kill Germans when his religion forbade it? Captain Danforth and his battalion commander, Major George Edward Buxton, spent hours debating theology and philosophy with Alvin. They discussed the concept of just war, the idea that sometimes violence is necessary to stop greater evil. They argued that defending innocent people from aggression was morally different from murder. They pointed to biblical examples of righteous warfare. These discussions profoundly affected Alvin. The officers gave Alvin a leave of absence to return home and think about his situation. Alvin spent 2 weeks in the Tennessee mountains, praying, reading his Bible, and struggling with the decision. He walked to a mountaintop and spent an entire night in prayer, asking God for guidance. By morning, he had reached a decision. He would serve. He would fight. If necessary, he would kill. He believed God had shown him that this war was necessary to protect innocent people from German aggression. In May 1918, the 82nd Division deployed to France. Alvin York, now a corporal, crossed the Atlantic with his regiment. They landed in France and moved to the front lines, where the war had been raging for nearly 4 years. The Western Front was a nightmare landscape of trenches, barbed wire, shell craters, and mud. Millions of men had already died. The Germans occupied strong defensive positions, and Allied forces were preparing for final offensives to end the war.
Alvin's first experience of combat was terrifying. Artillery shells exploded constantly, throwing up geysers of mud and shrapnel. Machine gun fire swept across no man's land. Poison gas drifted through trenches, forcing soldiers to wear masks that made breathing difficult. Men died from bullets, explosions, gas, disease, and the sheer stress of constant combat. It was industrial warfare on a scale never before seen in human history. But Alvin York adapted. His mountain background prepared him for hardship. He could endure cold, wet, hunger, and exhaustion better than city boys who had grown up with modern conveniences. His religious faith gave him calm in the chaos. He believed that God would protect him if it was his will, and if not, then dying in a righteous cause was acceptable. And his marksmanship skills, developed hunting in Tennessee mountains, translated perfectly to combat. By October 1918, the war was nearing its end. Germany was exhausted, its armies retreating, its home front collapsing. But the fighting remained brutal. Allied commanders wanted to push the Germans back as far as possible before any armistice to ensure favorable peace terms. The 82nd Division was assigned to participate in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, the largest American military operation of the war. On October 8, 1918, Alvin York's company was ordered to attack German positions in the Argonne Forest. Their objective was to capture a railroad hub, but German machine gun nests blocked their advance. These weren't ordinary defensive positions. German machine gunners had been entrenched for years, with overlapping fields of fire, reinforced bunkers, and clear sight lines. Any frontal assault would result in massive casualties. Company G attacked at dawn. Immediately, German machine guns opened fire. American soldiers fell in waves, cut down by interlocking machine gun fire. The attack stalled. Men dove into shell holes and behind trees, pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. The company commander was hit. Other officers were killed or wounded. The attack was collapsing into chaos. Sergeant Bernard Early, a career soldier, took command of the remnants of the company. He identified the problem, a network of German machine gun nests on a hillside, positioned to devastate any frontal assault. Early assembled a patrol of 17 men, including Corporal Alvin York, to work around the German flank and attack the machine gun nests from behind. It was a desperate gamble, but the only option. The patrol moved through the forest, using trees and terrain for cover, working their way around the German position. They moved quietly, slowly, using every bit of fieldcraft they knew. Miraculously, they reached the rear of the German position undetected. They found themselves looking down at German soldiers manning machine guns, completely unaware that Americans were behind them. Early ordered an attack. The American patrol opened fire, shooting into the German position from behind. Germans fell, completely surprised. But then German soldiers began surrendering, dozens of them, hands raised shouting "Kamerad," the German word for comrade, indicating surrender. The patrol had stumbled onto not just machine gun nests, but a battalion headquarters with over 100 German soldiers. As the Americans tried to secure the prisoners, German machine guns on the hillside above them swiveled and opened fire. The German gunners, realizing Americans were in their position, began shooting at anything that moved. Several American soldiers were killed instantly. Others were wounded. Sergeant Early was hit and incapacitated. The patrol was in chaos, surrounded by German prisoners, taking fire from German machine guns above, with most of their leaders dead or wounded. Alvin York found himself in command of the remaining Americans. Only 7 unwounded soldiers and a growing number of German prisoners. The situation was impossible. German machine gunners above them continued firing. If York and his men tried to retreat, they would be cut down. If they stayed, they would eventually be killed or forced to surrender. Alvin York had to make a decision. He later described a strange calm that came over him. The terror and confusion fell away. He was back in the Tennessee mountains, hunting. The German machine gunners were targets, just like turkeys or deer, except these targets were trying to kill him and his men. Alvin York began to shoot. Using a German machine gun nest as cover, York aimed at the German gunners above him. The distance was significant, several hundred yards, but well within his range. He aimed carefully, firing one shot at a time, and began dropping German machine gunners. One shot, one kill. Another shot, another German fell. York worked methodically, calmly, using the marksmanship skills learned hunting in Tennessee mountains. German soldiers tried to locate the American sharpshooter, killing their comrades. They poured machine gun fire toward York's position, but he was partially concealed and kept moving. When one position became too dangerous, he shifted to another, always finding cover, always staying calm. He continued shooting, one round, one German. His rifle never seemed to miss. The German soldiers couldn't understand what was happening. Their machine gunners were falling one after another. No matter how much they shot back, the Americans kept firing with deadly accuracy. York was performing what modern military analysts would call suppressive precision fire, shooting accurately enough to kill while suppressing return fire through sheer intimidation. At one point, a German officer and 5 soldiers charged down the hill toward York with fixed bayonets, trying to kill him before he could reload. He had been shooting his rifle, which held 5 rounds. As the Germans charged, he switched to his pistol and shot them one by one, starting with the last man in the line and working forward, a technique he learned turkey hunting, where you shoot the back bird first so the others don't scatter. He killed all 6 charging Germans before they reached him. Then he returned to his rifle and continued picking off machine gun gunners. The psychological impact on the Germans was devastating. This lone American seemed impossible to kill, was shooting with supernatural accuracy, and showed no fear whatsoever. German morale began to collapse. After York had killed somewhere between 20 and 28 German soldiers, accounts vary, a German major who'd been commanding the position approached York. Through gestures and broken English, the major indicated he wanted to surrender. If York would stop shooting, the major would order his remaining soldiers to surrender. York agreed. The German major blew his whistle and shouted orders. German soldiers began emerging from positions all along the hillside, hands raised, weapons discarded. York and his 7 remaining Americans suddenly had over 130 German prisoners. York had single-handedly neutralized an entire German position that had pinned down an American battalion. But York's challenge wasn't over. He now had to get these prisoners back to American lines, through terrain still containing German positions. York organized the prisoners into a column, placed the German major at the front, and began marching them back. Along the way, they encountered more German positions. York would aim his rifle at the German major and order him to command the positions to surrender. Intimidated by York's reputation, word had spread about the crazy American who couldn't be killed. More Germans surrendered. By the time York delivered his prisoners to the American rear area, he had 132 prisoners, had silenced 35 machine gun nests, and had killed at least 25 German soldiers, possibly more, as some estimates go as high as 28 killed. He had accomplished this with 1 rifle, 1 pistol, and 7 other American soldiers, only 2 of which were unwounded. General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces in Europe, personally called York's action the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of all the armies of Europe. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch said it was the greatest individual feat of the war. Military analysts studying the action still struggle to explain how one man accomplished so much against such overwhelming odds.
Alvin York was promoted to sergeant and awarded the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. He also received the Distinguished Service Cross, the French Croix de Guerre, and decorations from several other Allied nations. He became the most famous American soldier of World War I, celebrated in newspapers around the world. From a poor, barely educated Tennessee farmer, he had become an international hero. But Alvin York was deeply uncomfortable with fame. He insisted he had just done his duty. He said God had protected him, that he couldn't take credit for actions he believed were guided by divine intervention. When offered money for his story, endorsement deals, and movie contracts, York refused. He said his actions weren't for sale, that profiting from killing would dishonor the dead. York returned to Tennessee in 1919 to a hero's welcome. Parades were held in his honor. Politicians praised him. The state of Tennessee gave him a farm, better land than he had ever owned, with a house far superior to the cabin he grew up in. Alvin married Gracie Williams, the girl he had courted before the war, and they settled down to raise a family. But Alvin York struggled with what he had done. He had killed at least 25 men, possibly more. He had taken human lives, violated the commandment he had believed was absolute. Yes, it was in war. Yes, it was to save American lives. Yes, German soldiers were trying to kill him and his comrades, but they were still human beings, many of them young men conscripted into service just like him. Their deaths weighed on his conscience. York also struggled financially. The farm given to him required maintenance and taxes he couldn't afford. He had turned down lucrative offers during and immediately after the war, but now faced poverty again. In 1940, facing financial difficulties, York finally agreed to let Hollywood make a movie about his life, Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper. The film was a massive success, winning Cooper an Academy Award and making York famous again. The movie sanitized York's story, portraying him as unambiguously heroic, with no moral struggles or psychological costs. But the real Alvin York was more complicated. He had done something extraordinary, but it came at enormous personal cost. He spent the rest of his life trying to balance pride in his service with guilt over the killing, gratitude for surviving with sorrow for those who didn't. During World War II, Alvin York supported the war effort, believing that fighting Nazi Germany was just and necessary. He toured the country promoting war bonds and encouraging young men to serve. But he also spoke about the cost of war, the psychological toll of combat, the importance of supporting veterans when they came home. York understood that warfare changes people, that killing leaves scars even when it's necessary. York suffered a stroke in 1954 that left him partially paralyzed. He spent his final years confined to bed, cared for by his wife Gracie and their children. He died on September 2, 1964, at the age of 76. He was buried with full military honors in the Wolf River Cemetery in Pall Mall, Tennessee, the same mountains where he had grown up in poverty. His legacy is complex. To many, Alvin York represents the ideal American soldier, reluctant to fight, but devastating when necessary, humble in victory, faithful throughout. His story embodies American values of individual courage, resourcefulness, and moral clarity. He proved that an uneducated mountain farmer could accomplish extraordinary things through skill, courage, and faith. But York also represents the cost of warfare on individuals. He was a man who didn't want to kill, who struggled with the moral weight of taking lives, who carried that burden for the rest of his life. His story reminds us that even the most successful warriors pay psychological prices that medals and parades can't erase. Modern military analysts still study the action in the Argonne Forest on October 8, 1918. How did one man accomplish so much? Marksmanship explains some of it. York's shooting was extraordinarily accurate. Tactical skill explains more. He used cover effectively, chose positions wisely, and remained calm under fire. But there's also an element that defies analysis: courage, determination, and perhaps divine protection, depending on your beliefs. The Alvin C. York Institute, a high school in Jamestown, Tennessee, was named in his honor. The school serves students from the same impoverished mountain region where York grew up, offering education to young people who might otherwise have no opportunities. York was deeply involved in establishing the school, believing that education was essential to lifting his community out of poverty. The school continues today, York's most lasting contribution to his homeland. York's uniform, medals, and the rifles he carried in France are displayed at the Tennessee State Museum in Nashville and at York's home, now a state historic site. The site receives thousands of visitors annually, people wanting to understand the man behind the legend. Tour guides tell visitors about both York's extraordinary military actions and his lifelong struggle to reconcile those actions with his religious faith. The moment that defines Alvin York's legacy came late in his life, when a journalist asked him about October 8, 1918. What did he think about when he remembered that day? York was silent for a long time, clearly struggling with memories and emotions. Then, he gave an answer that revealed the true burden he carried. He said he thought about the German boys he killed, young men probably conscripted like him who had mothers and sweethearts waiting for them to come home. He had done what was necessary to save American lives, and he would do it again if required. But he had never celebrated killing those men, never taken pride in their deaths. They were casualties of a terrible war, and he prayed for their souls as much for the souls of Americans who died. That was the weight he carried every day of his life. That was Alvin York. Not a mindless killer or a war enthusiast, a deeply religious man forced by circumstances to do something his faith told him was wrong. A humble farmer who became a warrior, accomplished the impossible, and then spent the rest of his life trying to make peace with what he had done. His story reminds us that warfare's true heroes are often those most reluctant to fight, and that the psychological costs of combat last far longer than the battles themselves.